What secrets are buried in government UFO files? For decades, stories of strange lights in the sky and chilling tales of alien abductions have been dismissed as fantasy, delusion, or the stuff of late-night radio. But when the veil of secrecy began to lift, and declassified documents trickled out of the archives of powerful governments, an unsettling realization emerged. Some of the most convincing alien abduction stories were not just whispered by ordinary people, they were hidden within official reports, stamped confidential, and locked away from the public eye. This is not just folklore, nor is it confined to the realm of conspiracy theorists. These are cases noted, analyzed, and in some instances, reluctantly acknowledged by intelligence agencies, defense departments, and military investigators who had no interest in chasing fairy tales. The title of what you're about to hear, Convincing Alien Abduction Stories Hidden in Declassified UFO Files, is not an exaggeration. These are accounts preserved in the cold language of bureaucracy, yet they reveal moments of terror, disorientation, and unexplainable phenomena that defy the logic of our world. The atmosphere of these files is chilling in its simplicity. No dramatic storytelling, no sensational claims, just matter-of-fact descriptions of events that read like summaries of nightmares. People vanished without a trace, reappeared with strange marks, or reported lost hours under circumstances no investigation could resolve. And while many of these cases remained buried for decades, the slow process of declassification has opened a crack in the door, allowing us to glimpse truths that were never meant for public eyes. Tonight, we step into that crack of light. We'll travel through the reports, connect the testimonies, and uncover what governments tried to hide, the most haunting abduction stories preserved in their own secret files. For as long as human beings have stared at the night sky, there has been a tension between wonder and fear. On one hand, the stars have inspired us with beauty, mystery, and the possibility of life beyond our planet. On the other, they have stirred deep anxieties about forces that might be watching us from the void, far more advanced and far less benevolent than we could imagine. By the middle of the 20th century, this ancient tension took on a new dimension as governments around the world began quietly collecting, cataloguing, and studying reports of unidentified flying objects. The secrecy was not casual. It was deliberate, calculated, and often maintained under layers of classification that only decades later would be peeled back to reveal what officials once knew, or at least suspected, about strange encounters in the skies and, disturbingly, on the ground. The United States was perhaps the most visible actor in this unfolding drama, though far from the only one. In the late 1940s, with the Second World War only recently concluded and the Cold War taking shape, reports of mysterious aerial phenomena began to pour in from military pilots, radar operators, and civilians. Some sightings were quickly explained as weather balloons, experimental aircraft, or misidentified stars, but others resisted simple answers. It was during this period that projects like Sign, Grudge, and eventually Blue Book were created, ostensibly to investigate these incidents with scientific rigor. What has become clear in hindsight, however, is that even while public statements minimize the significance of UFOs, private reports often told a very different story, one of genuine puzzlement, unease, and sometimes alarm within the ranks of the military and intelligence services. But the United States was not alone. Across the Atlantic, the United Kingdom also maintained secret files on UFOs, overseen by the Ministry of Defense. These records, some of which have since been declassified, reveal a methodical effort to track reports that ranged from bright lights in the sky to encounters described in deeply unsettling terms by civilians and servicemen alike. To the British establishment, UFOs were not merely an eccentric curiosity. They were a potential national security issue, especially if the sightings represented advanced technology belonging to rival powers. The language of the reports was cautious, but the very act of collecting and storing them spoke volumes about the seriousness with which the matter was treated, at least behind closed doors. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, secrecy reached an even higher level. During the height of the Cold War, the Russian military and intelligence agencies devoted resources to studying unidentified aerial phenomena, sometimes interpreting them through the lens of military threat, sometimes through the possibility of scientific anomaly. In some cases, reports surfaced of cosmonauts encountering unexplained lights during orbital missions, or of entire villages in remote parts of the Soviet Union describing strange visitors who appeared in the dead of night. The Soviet archives remain far less open than their Western counterparts, but enough fragments have emerged to suggest that behind the Iron Curtain, too, alien abduction accounts and UFO sightings were not ignored. They were logged, classified, and hidden from the public. What is most striking, when looking across these different nations, is not just the volume of reports, but the recurring patterns. Again and again, individuals described encounters that shared eerie similarities. Missing time, physical marks on the body, unexplained lights, paralysis, or a sensation of being taken from familiar surroundings into an environment that was utterly foreign. For decades, officials dismissed these abduction stories as hallucinations, dreams, or the fabrications of troubled minds. Yet they still archived them. Why? If such accounts were truly meaningless, why devote resources to documenting them, storing them in classified files, and revisiting them when new reports surfaced? The answer, or at least part of it, lies in the dual role these documents played. On one hand, they served as a catalogue of unusual human behavior and strange reports that might one day be useful to psychologists, sociologists, or intelligence officers studying mass perception. On the other hand, they functioned as a kind of safety net, ensuring that if any of these encounters did prove to represent something real, the evidence would not be lost. Governments could not afford to ignore the possibility, however remote, that abduction accounts pointed to contact with a force beyond human control. This is where the documents become more than curiosities. They are not just stories written down by ordinary people. They are stories preserved, analyzed, and often quietly acknowledged at the highest levels of power. The voices inside these files are not only those of frightened farmers, shaken housewives, or bewildered drivers who pulled over on dark country roads. They are also the voices of military officers, intelligence analysts, and even scientists tasked with sifting through the inexplicable. Their reports may be stripped of emotion, their language may be clinical, but the underlying narratives carry weight precisely because of the context in which they were recorded. Even the bureaucratic coldness of these files cannot hide the unease they convey. A declassified memorandum might speak blandly of anomalous aerial activity or alleged personal experiences, but between the lines lies the same terror and confusion that runs through personal testimonies told in more human terms. When ordinary citizens described being pulled from their homes by beings they could not comprehend, governments filed the accounts away, sometimes cross-referencing them with radar data, sometimes comparing them to other unexplained cases. The consistency was impossible to ignore. Over time, this quiet archiving created a parallel history, one where the extraordinary was hidden behind layers of red tape and official indifference, yet preserved all the same. For those willing to dig through the declassified material, the picture that emerges is chilling. It is not that governments proved alien abductions were real, nor that they could explain the phenomena. It is that they treated them seriously enough to collect, classify, and conceal them for decades. That choice, in itself, tells us that something about these encounters defied easy dismissal. And so we arrive at the reason these documents matter. Without them, abduction stories might be brushed aside as folklore, lost among the countless myths and legends of human imagination. But preserved in official files, stamped with government seals, they carry a different weight. They connect the fragile voices of ordinary men and women with the machinery of the state, suggesting that the boundary between private terror and public policy is thinner than we might believe. In these documents, the strange and the bureaucratic meet, creating a record that is as haunting as it is unsettling. Having shifted from the broad sweep of governments quietly collecting eyewitness reports, it helps to focus on the most famous and consequential American archive, Project Blue Book, the United States Air Force's systematic study of unidentified aerial phenomena from 1952 to 1969. Blue Book was presented to the public as a sober scientific effort with two stated aims: to determine whether UFOs presented a threat to national security and to analyze sightings with analytic rigor. Practically speaking, it functioned as a centralized filing system for thousands of accounts from civilians and service members, and it became a contested space where military prudence, scientific skepticism, and public curiosity intersected. By the time Blue Book was terminated, the Air Force had logged 12,618 reports, and its summaries noted that 701 of those cases remained unexplained after investigation. The project's internal mechanics reveal why its archive is consequential. Early in the effort, the Air Force asked outside experts to help design consistent reporting procedures and to apply a statistical lens to the growing volume of data. The resulting document, Special Report Number 14, reduced thousands of narrative accounts to coded fields: shape, speed, brightness, duration, number and training level of witnesses, and the presence or absence of instrumental corroboration such as radar. The analysts then categorized cases as identified, insufficient information, or unidentified. The headline statistics were revealing. While a clear majority were deemed identified, a persistent minority resisted conventional explanation, and that minority disproportionately included the higher quality reports that came from trained observers or were backed by instruments. That methodological framing matters for the question of abductions because Blue Book was organized around observable phenomena rather than phenomenological categories of personal experience. There was no standardized checkbox for abduction or missing time. Instead, what later would be classified by ufologists as abduction-like material is embedded in narratives, witness interviews, and follow-up correspondence. The files thus preserve the administrative footprint of extraordinary personal reports: who the witnesses were, what investigators asked, and which corroborating data was sought, rather than a tidy tally of people who claimed to have been taken aboard a craft. That archival shape is one reason certain cases, when they contain detailed personal testimony and some objective data, became focal points of public attention. The best-known example is the 1961 case of Barney and Betty Hill, in which a husband and wife reported a night drive interrupted by a strange light, a gap of hours they could not account for, and later memories recovered under hypnosis. The Hill narrative combined missing time, descriptions of humanoid figures, and medical and investigatory threads that gave the case a documentary texture beyond anecdote. Whether one reads the Hill file as evidence, as a psychological episode, or as cultural performance depends on interpretive frameworks, but the file's existence within official and quasi-official records illustrates the exact point. Abduction language lives inside the margins of records assembled for other purposes. Because Blue Book did not code abduction as a single variable, historians and archivists cannot simply count entries in a column. Instead, they comb the declassified files, FOIA releases, and related agency correspondence for mentions of missing time, marks on the body, hypnotic regression, or corroborating sensor data. This is painstaking archival work. The result is not a tidy number, but a pattern of incidents that collectively suggest a recurring cluster of complaints and sensations. Many narratives are slender, some are rich with detail, and a few combine witness credibility with instrument corroboration. Those combinations are the ones researchers watch most closely. Publication practices and security concerns shaped what became public and what remained behind seals and redactions. The Air Force issued summaries and sometimes public statements meant to calm and contextualize. At the same time, files containing witness names, internal memos, and sensitive interagency exchanges were often withheld or heavily redacted for years. The tension between the soothing public posture and the unruly content of private files means that the record is both richer and more vexing than most popular accounts indicate. A historian who engages the Blue Book archive must therefore read both the sanitized public line and the underlying investigative record. The operational dimension of Blue Book also needs emphasis. Military interest in unidentified reports rarely stemmed from a desire for spectacle. Officials were often worried about airspace security and sensor integrity. Some cases involved radar returns that did not match known aircraft or objects that evaded intercepts, presenting real, practical challenges for controllers and pilots. Others registered in defense files because they occurred near restricted areas, flight test ranges, or strategic installations, where an unexplained object could mean a foreign platform or an instrumentation anomaly requiring immediate technical attention. These practical concerns help explain why the phenomenon shows up in internal briefings and contractor reports, rather than just in press clippings. There are also more provocative layers to the archive. Over the decades, retired service members and researchers have pointed to incidents involving sensitive infrastructure, nuclear missile complexes, radar sites, and flight test ranges, where anomalous phenomena were reported to have coincided with equipment malfunctions or unexplained changes in system behavior. In some of those testimonies, the phenomenon appears as an irritant to strategic stability. In others, it is simply an eerie coincidence. Whatever one's view of causality, the fact that such reports made their way into official correspondence and back-channel briefings explains at least part of why governments took some sightings seriously beneath the surface. Reading Blue Book alongside the later, secretive efforts of the Department of Defense and intelligence agencies produces a complex picture. Official public messaging often leaned toward closure and reassurance, while classified or lightly publicized studies preserved the raw, unresolved testimony that did not fit neatly into prosaic categories. Those archival layers, public summaries, declassified case files, and the episodic emergence of covert programs mean that the historical record is rarely as simple as the blackboard explanations popularized in press coverage. Instead, it is a palimpsest, explanations written over earlier notes, with occasional passages left legible for later researchers to puzzle over. That ambivalence is why analysts and historians keep returning to the Blue Book corpus and its later descendants. Special Report No. 14's paradox, that higher quality reports were more likely to remain unexplained, still nags at skeptics and proponents alike. When the investigator was a trained observer and the instrumentation seemed to corroborate testimony, analysts could not as easily write off the report as a mass delusion or misidentification, yet after investigation many of those higher quality reports were simply left open. Those residual unknowns are precisely what has kept the subject in the purview of national security officials, and what turned a handful of high-profile files into enduring puzzles for historians. Project Blue Book did not settle the matter of abductions, nor did it eliminate the public appetite for dramatic testimony. What it did leave behind is a complex record, a mass of reports that range from mundane misidentifications to stubbornly anomalous events, and a bureaucratic trail that shows officials sometimes perplexed, sometimes alarmed, and sometimes inclined to explain away. Reading that record carefully, with attention to context, to quality of observation, and to the institutional choices about disclosure, is the only way to grasp why some abduction stories were relegated to margins while others entered both the public imagination and the official archive. And that careful reading is precisely what makes the declassified files and subsequent releases indispensable sources for anyone trying to connect ordinary testimonies with sustained state-level interest. By the late 1950s, UFO sightings were already filling military files around the world, but most accounts centered on lights, disks, or radar anomalies that never descended into the personal, physical sphere of human experience. That changed dramatically in 1957 in the Brazilian countryside, when a young farmer named Antonio Villas-Boas gave one of the first detailed testimonies of being taken aboard a craft and subjected to what he described as both examination and contact with beings not of this world. His story, strange and disquieting in its intimacy, marked a turning point, the transition from distant lights in the night sky to claims of direct human involvement, abduction, and even experimentation. It was a case that intelligence agencies and UFO researchers alike could not easily ignore, because it introduced elements that would later reappear with uncanny regularity in abduction narratives across decades and continents. Antonio was just 23 years old when the encounter took place. Living on a remote farm near São Francisco de Sales in Minas Gerais, he was used to the rhythms of rural life, long hours of physical labor, quiet nights broken only by the sounds of animals, and a horizon unmarred by city lights. On the evening of October 16, 1957, while ploughing fields with a tractor under the cool night air, He reported seeing a bright red light crossing the sky. At first, he assumed it might be an aircraft, but as it drew closer, the object descended with a deliberate movement that did not match the behavior of any plane he knew. The tractor's engine sputtered, faltered, and died. Bathed in the crimson glow, Antonio realized he was no longer dealing with something distant and abstract. This was a presence entering his world. What followed was a sequence of events that reads like a template for countless later abduction stories, though at the time nothing like it had been so carefully detailed. According to Antonio, the craft landed near his field and extended what he described as a kind of ramp. Several small beings emerged, humanoid in form but with odd, inhuman features, large, elongated eyes, pale complexions, and movements that seemed both purposeful and mechanical. They seized him with surprising strength despite their smaller stature and dragged him toward the waiting craft. Antonio struggled, attempting to resist, but the beings overpowered him and forced him inside. The interior, he later said, was suffused with light that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The beings stripped him of his clothes and smeared his body with a gel-like substance that left his skin tingling and numb. He was then led into another chamber, where instruments he could not identify surrounded him. He reported that the beings drew blood samples, attaching suction devices to his chin and arms, before leaving him alone in the room. The next stage of the ordeal was even stranger. A female figure, strikingly different from the others, entered. Antonio described her as human-like in most respects, though with large, slanted eyes and white blonde hair. She engaged in sexual intercourse with him in what he interpreted as part of an experiment or reproductive program. He later said she acted as though she wanted to conceive, and after the encounter she pointed upward, toward the sky, before departing, as if to indicate that whatever offspring resulted would not remain on Earth. After what felt like hours, Antonio was escorted back outside the craft, left in the field, and watched as the object lifted silently into the sky and vanished. Disoriented, nauseous, and shaken, he returned home, where his family observed burns and strange marks on his skin, as well as symptoms resembling radiation exposure, headaches, loss of appetite, and lesions that resisted immediate healing. These physical effects gave his account a troubling weight. Unlike dreamlike or purely psychological encounters, Antonio's story was tethered to observable changes in his body that others could confirm. When his case reached the attention of Brazilian physician Dr. Olavo Fontes, associated with the National School of Medicine in Rio de Janeiro, it gained a legitimacy uncommon for the time. Fontes examined Antonio, noting his symptoms, and produced a detailed report. Through this investigation, the case entered both local press and international UFO literature. What made it especially notable was the level of detail Antonio provided: descriptions of the craft's interior, the being's appearance, their procedures, and even the sequence of events that unfolded aboard. Unlike earlier, vaguer reports, this account could not easily be brushed aside as a fleeting light or a confused memory. It was structured, consistent, and narrated with precision. It was this precision that drew the attention of intelligence agencies abroad. Declassified files reveal that both American and European analysts monitored reports coming out of Brazil, partly because of Cold War concerns. Any strange aerial activity in South America, particularly near agricultural regions or rural populations, was of potential interest to foreign powers wary of unconventional technologies or psychological warfare experiments. Antonio's story may have sounded fantastical, but it landed in an era when governments were unwilling to discount anything that might mask military innovation or serve as propaganda. That his testimony included physical evidence of illness only deepened the curiosity of those reading through intelligence channels. Skeptics argued then, as they do now, that the case could have been fabricated. They suggested Antonio may have invented the story for attention or been influenced by emerging UFO narratives in the press. Yet the detail of his testimony, the corroboration of his physical condition, and his apparent reluctance to seek publicity all weakened the claim of hoax. Unlike later self-promoters, Antonio did not initially rush to the media. Instead, his story filtered outward through investigators. For agencies trying to separate noise from signal in the growing flood of UFO reports, this made his case stand out. Looking back, what makes the Villas-Boas encounter so significant is not only its strangeness, but its role as a prototype. Elements that later became staples of abduction lore appear here in almost embryonic form: paralysis or loss of control, medical examinations, reproductive themes, communication through gestures rather than words, and the return of the subject to the point of abduction with altered health. Intelligence officers who encountered similar patterns in later files could trace the lineage back to this early case in rural Brazil, recognizing that these were not isolated anecdotes but recurring motifs that suggested either a shared psychological archetype or a real, external phenomenon manifesting consistently. The contrast between the rustic simplicity of Antonio's life and the sophisticated, clinical atmosphere of the craft he described is another reason the story resonated. It underscored a recurring theme, that these encounters did not happen only to those steeped in science fiction or predisposed to imagination, but to ordinary people with little reason to invent such elaborate scenarios. For agencies cataloging abduction narratives, this fact was essential, because it suggested that the phenomenon crossed social, educational, and cultural boundaries. In later years, as abduction stories multiplied in North America and Europe, researchers and officials alike could look back to the Villas-Boas case as a kind of origin point. His testimony had already mapped out the terrain, the beings, the procedures, the physical after-effects. When Betty and Barney Hill came forward in the 1960s with their own abduction account, the echoes of Antonio's story were impossible to miss. Though the settings differed, Brazilian farmland versus a dark New England highway, the underlying patterns were startlingly similar. The connection reinforced the sense that these were not isolated cultural inventions, but part of a broader, enigmatic pattern that continued to surface despite geographic and cultural divides. For intelligence services, this continuity was both a puzzle and a reason to maintain quiet vigilance. Were these people tapping into a collective mythology? Were they victims of secret medical experiments? Or were they, as they claimed, caught up in genuine encounters with non-human entities? The files do not answer those questions, but their very existence demonstrates that officials considered the matter worth recording. And so Antonio Villas-Boas, a young farmer who thought he was just working his fields on a cool October night, became a cornerstone of the hidden archive of alien abduction stories. An ordinary man whose extraordinary testimony shaped the contours of a mystery that governments still wrestle with today. If Antonio Villas-Boas's ordeal in Brazil established the first pattern of what abduction accounts could look like, it was the case of Barney and Betty Hill in 1961 that forced the phenomenon into the American consciousness and, more importantly, into official files that had already been bulging with UFO reports. Unlike the remote farm worker in South America, the Hills were an interracial couple living in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Betty a social worker, Barney a postal worker and civil rights advocate. They were educated, respected, and, by all accounts, practical individuals. When their account emerged, it was not the story of recluses on the fringes of society, but of an ordinary middle-class couple whose experience would become the benchmark against which nearly all later abduction narratives were measured. On the night of September 19, 1961, the Hills were driving back from a brief vacation in Niagara Falls and Montreal. The long, quiet road through the White Mountains stretched before them, empty and dark. Betty first noticed a strange light in the sky that seemed to follow their car. At first, she dismissed it as a star, a planet, or perhaps an aircraft, but its movements were erratic, darting, hovering, and then closing the distance. Barney, more skeptical, pulled over to the side of the road near Indian Head and retrieved his binoculars. Through the lenses he claimed to see a structured craft, with windows, and inside those windows, figures moving as though watching him. Fear surged through him. He hurried back to the car and insisted they drive away quickly. As they sped south, a deep buzzing sound struck the vehicle, and the couple felt waves of tingling sensations pass through their bodies. Then silence. The next thing they recalled clearly was driving on a different stretch of highway, 2 hours later than they should have been, with no memory of how that time had slipped away. This period of missing time was the seed from which their abduction account grew. In the days that followed, the Hills experienced anxiety, nightmares, and physical symptoms they could not explain. Betty's dreams, in particular, were vivid and unsettling. She dreamed of being stopped on the road, of small humanoid beings escorting her and Barney onto a craft, of examinations conducted with cold precision. The imagery was so strong that she confided in a few family members and eventually in investigators from the civilian UFO group NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. By 1963, with the couple still plagued by unease, they sought the help of psychiatrist Dr. Benjamin Simon in Boston, a specialist in treating trauma. Under hypnosis, both Barney and Betty recounted remarkably similar narratives, despite being interviewed separately. They described being taken aboard a craft, subjected to medical-like procedures, and confronted by beings they could only describe as humanoid but not human. Barney, who had originally resisted the idea, became deeply emotional during sessions, breaking down as he described a strange device being pressed against his groin and his terror at the figure's large eyes. Betty, meanwhile, recounted a moment in which she asked one of the beings where they had come from, and was shown a star map with lines connecting points in a way that suggested trade or travel routes. Later, she sketched the map under hypnosis, and some enthusiasts would claim it bore resemblance to the Zeta Reticuli star system, though this identification remains controversial. What is important here is not whether the Hills' hypnotically recovered memories reflected actual events or confabulated dreams. What mattered, especially for investigators and government analysts, was the precision of the accounts, the couple's reputation for reliability, and the consistency of their narratives under separate hypnosis sessions. When their story filtered into the public domain, it was soon folded into the files of the Air Force's Project Blue Book, which by then was already collecting civilian abduction reports with cautious attention. The Air Force files do not reveal an open admission of belief in the Hills story, but they do demonstrate that officials were aware of it, catalogued it, and considered it within the broader corpus of unexplained phenomena. Civilian UFO organizations had already been forwarding reports to Blue Book, and the Hills account, with its vivid details and the authority of Dr. Simon's psychiatric work, could not be ignored. Internal FBI memos from the same period also show that agencies were monitoring UFO-related claims, partly out of concern that they could mask psychological manipulation or Cold War disinformation campaigns. To intelligence services, the content of the Hills story was less important than the fact that it generated national attention, raising questions of public perception, social stability, and the possibility that foreign powers might exploit such narratives. Yet within these bureaucratic concerns lies a fascinating contradiction. Officially, the Air Force dismissed most abduction stories as products of imagination or confusion. Unofficially, however, they archived them, studied them, and at times compared them to other cases. This suggests that, even as the public was told not to worry, behind closed doors there was at least a quiet acknowledgement that something in these accounts merited preservation. And because the Hills case was the most prominent of its era, it became a reference point. Later files would sometimes echo phrases or details first seen in the Hills testimony: medical procedures, missing time, humanoid figures with large eyes, and the return of subjects to their original location with fractured memory. The Hills themselves did not seek fame. They were reluctant, even embarrassed, about the publicity that followed. Barney, in particular, suffered emotionally from the ordeal, both from the experience itself and from the skepticism it attracted. Betty, more open to sharing the story, nevertheless insisted it was not something they had invented. Their sincerity, combined with the medical and psychiatric documentation surrounding their case, made it difficult for even the harshest skeptics to dismiss them outright as attention seekers. This sincerity is precisely what lent their story weight within official channels. In time, the Hill case was adapted into books and even a television movie, but long before Hollywood dramatized it, the files had already locked it into history. Air Force analysts, though they may not have endorsed the extraterrestrial explanation, recognized that the narrative could not simply be discarded. It was too detailed, too consistent, and too influential. In the decades that followed, whenever a new abduction report landed on an investigator's desk, the unspoken comparison was to Barney and Betty Hill. Were the details similar? Was there missing time? Were medical procedures described? Did hypnosis play a role? These became the benchmarks, and those benchmarks originated in a modest car ride through New Hampshire that spiraled into one of the most famous UFO cases in history. The Hill case also sharpened the lens through which intelligence agencies looked at such reports. In an age when psychological warfare and propaganda were real weapons, the possibility that entire populations could be swayed by extraordinary claims was not lost on officials. Thus, even if they doubted the literal truth of the Hills abduction, the way the case gripped the media and the public was itself of interest. Files that mention the case often do so not only in terms of its content, but in terms of its cultural impact, a recognition that the story had crossed from personal experience into the realm of collective myth. That cultural impact is precisely why their narrative continues to resurface in declassified documents. It is not only that they claim to be taken aboard a craft, it is that their account created a framework, a vocabulary of missing time, medical procedures, star maps, and silent beings, that shaped both civilian testimony and the bureaucratic responses to it. Intelligence officers analyzing later cases could not help but see echoes of the Hills, and the very act of comparison reinforced the legitimacy of their place in the files. And so the Hills, like Antonio Villas-Boas before them, became unwilling architects of a strange archive, the collection of human encounters with the unknown that governments would catalogue, classify, and guard for decades. Their story bridged the gap between personal terror and official curiosity, between whispered nightmares and typed reports filed away in drawers marked confidential. Theirs was not simply a story of a night gone wrong. It was the story that cemented alien abduction in the official imagination, a point of reference for analysts, skeptics, and believers alike. Military files, unlike the personal testimonies of civilians, carried a different kind of weight. They were not built on memory alone, but often on logs, radar data, and the meticulous documentation of men trained to record every detail with precision. That is why when stories of missing time and abduction-like episodes surfaced among soldiers and pilots, they were quietly but firmly preserved within classified archives. The expectation had always been that military discipline would filter out exaggeration. Yet some of the most unnerving reports emerged not from frightened farmers or curious skywatchers, but from highly trained personnel sworn to defend national airspace. One of the earliest documented hints of abduction-like military encounters came during the Cold War, when the United States Air Force catalogued strange pilot experiences under Project Blue Book. Declassified files described cases in which aviators reported objects pacing their jets, only for their flight records to show gaps in time they could not explain. In some instances, their wristwatches and on-board clocks disagreed with control tower records. Although Blue Book analysts officially chalked these discrepancies up to instrument error or fatigue, the fact that such reports were filed at all, and cross-referenced with radar returns, suggests that more was at play than human error. Pilots were not merely seeing lights. Some of them were losing time. Radar itself often provided the strange confirmation. During the 1950s and 1960s, air defense networks in both the United States and the United Kingdom tracked fast-moving, unidentifiable objects that outran jets sent to intercept them. When pilots returned from these intercepts with fractured recollections, sometimes missing entire portions of the encounter, investigators were faced with a troubling dilemma. How could they dismiss the pilot's memories when radar tapes clearly showed that something was there? It is in these reports that the abduction theme began to creep silently into military records, not named as such, but described in the clinical language of missing time, unexplained radar correlation, and subjective memory gap. The Rendlesham Forest incident of December 1980 remains perhaps the most famous European example of military personnel experiencing what could be framed as abduction phenomena. For 3 nights, U.S. Air Force personnel stationed at RAF Woodbridge and RAF Bentwaters in Suffolk, England, reported extraordinary lights in the surrounding forest. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt himself drafted a memorandum for the Ministry of Defense describing beams of light, metallic objects, and radiation readings on the ground. Among the airmen, whispers circulated of something even stranger, the sense that time had been tampered with. Sergeant Jim Peniston, who claimed to have touched a landed craft, later described receiving streams of binary code directly into his mind. Another airman, John Burroughs, would decades later obtain veterans' medical benefits after documents confirmed that he had suffered unexplained health effects tied to that night. Some researchers and even retired officers have suggested that at least 2 airmen experienced missing time consistent with abduction scenarios. Whether or not they were taken aboard a craft, what matters is that their experience of time did not match the official record, and the Holt Memo, an official military document, locked those anomalies into history. Similar episodes appear in U.S. records tied to Strategic Air Command. In Montana during 1967, Air Force guards at Malmstrom reported a glowing object hovering near a missile silo just before nuclear missiles went offline. While this incident is usually cited as an example of UFOs tampering with defense systems, declassified testimony also reveals that some of the guards experienced gaps in their recollections. Interviews conducted afterward indicated that a few of them could not clearly recall entire stretches of their guard duty. Though investigators framed it as stress or fatigue, the eerie parallel to missing time in abduction stories is difficult to overlook. Once again, the military language was cautious, but the phenomenon itself echoed what civilians had already described. The United States was not alone. Soviet pilots during the 1970s and 1980s also filed strange reports, many of which surfaced after the Cold War in declassified KGB documents. One pilot described chasing a luminous sphere over the Caucasus region, only to black out and wake minutes later miles from his original position, with his instruments recording nothing unusual. Another Soviet file references a group of soldiers in the Urals who reported encountering a hovering disk that emitted a beam of light. They later discovered their watches disagreed by nearly half an hour. The pattern of missing time was no longer confined to American files. It stretched across rival superpowers, each documenting anomalies in careful bureaucratic phrasing but never daring to call them abductions. Fast forward to the 21st century, and the pattern continues in ways that are harder for authorities to suppress. The 2004 Nimitz encounters, now widely publicized after Pentagon confirmation, revealed Navy pilots chasing tic-tac-shaped objects over the Pacific. While these cases are not described officially as abductions, pilots like Commander David Fravor have openly admitted to encounters that defied physics, including radar operators testifying that the objects dropped from 80,000 feet to sea level in seconds. Behind the scenes, some pilot testimonies included strange memory lapses, moments where they could not account for portions of the chase. Radar tapes and cockpit recordings confirmed the pursuit, yet the pilots themselves sometimes spoke of fragmented recall. The Department of Defense acknowledged the objects as unidentified aerial phenomena, but once again, the deepest strangeness remained between the lines. Highly trained aviators reporting experiences that mirrored abduction narratives without ever naming them as such. What makes these military encounters so compelling is not just the strangeness of the reports, but the corroboration. When a farmer in a remote region describes losing 2 hours of memory, skeptics can dismiss it as fantasy. But when an Air Force officer's missing time coincides with radar data and official memos, the narrative changes. The credibility of the witness and the existence of physical records transform anecdote into evidence, at least enough to warrant preservation in classified files. And when those files are later declassified, they reveal that officials did not laugh these stories away. They studied them, archived them, and quietly acknowledged the unexplainable. The tension in these documents is palpable. On one hand, the official stance remains cautious. There is no proof of extraterrestrial abduction, only anomalies. On the other, the very act of documenting missing time, memory lapses, and radar correlations betrays a recognition that something extraordinary occurred. Military analysts were not in the business of indulging fantasies. They were in the business of cataloging threats, monitoring security, and preparing responses. That they chose to include such accounts in their reports suggests that, at least in some corners of the defense establishment, the possibility of forces beyond human comprehension was considered, if never publicly admitted. And so, the abduction-like experiences of soldiers and pilots became the silent heartbeat of classified archives. They linked the personal accounts of civilians to the official machinery of state, weaving missing time and unexplainable encounters into the very fabric of national defense records. When the curtain was eventually pulled back, through declassification, leaks, or reluctant admissions, it became clear that these were not isolated tales. They were patterns, repeated across continents, across decades, and across branches of the military. Pilots, radar operators, guards, and officers all found themselves in situations where time itself became unreliable, where memories fractured, and where the sky revealed things beyond doctrine. The rhythm of these reports carries us naturally forward, for if the military could not dismiss the unexplainable, then it is no surprise that intelligence agencies, operating in even deeper shadows, would take an even keener interest. And it is within those darker corridors of secrecy that the next layer of the story emerges. In the early evening of October 11, 1973, two men were quietly fishing on the Pascagoula River near Moss Point, Mississippi, unaware that their lives were about to intersect with an event that would leave an indelible mark on UFO history and official records. Charles Hickson, a 42-year-old shipyard worker, and Calvin Parker, just 19 and working on a nearby dredging project, had been enjoying the relative solitude of the riverbanks when a strange light appeared in the sky above them. At first, Hickson thought it might be a helicopter, while Parker later described a buzzing sound that seemed mechanical yet unplaceable. Within moments, they found themselves confronted by an extraordinary presence, a craft of unknown origin and beings that would change the narrative of alien encounters in America. What makes the Pascagoula case remarkable is not only the vividness of the men's account, but the meticulous way it entered the sphere of official attention. When the pair fled to the nearest authorities, trembling and insisting they had been taken aboard a craft, law enforcement officers treated the report with cautious seriousness. Sheriff's deputies documented the scene, taking statements and notes. The intensity of the men's terror, their consistency in recounting details, and the absence of any apparent motive to fabricate the story compelled the sheriff's office to contact the FBI. That federal involvement ensured the incident was recorded at a level beyond local folklore, preserving the account for decades and eventually placing it in the declassified archives where researchers could later study it in full. According to transcripts, Hickson and Parker described being lifted from the riverbank and brought aboard a cigar-shaped craft, its surface metallic and reflective. They recounted encountering beings that were distinctly humanoid in silhouette, but unlike any humans they had ever seen. Hickson, speaking with a quiver in his voice, emphasized their lack of visible facial features beyond rudimentary eyes and mouth, and Parker corroborated each detail independently. The pair claimed that the creatures performed what they perceived as an examination, touching their bodies with mechanical appendages and moving in a deliberate, almost clinical manner. There was no dialogue in the conventional sense, only an overwhelming sense of communication through presence and gesture, which intensified the terror of the experience. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the testimony was the acute awareness of time distortion. Hickson and Parker later reported that what seemed like several minutes felt like hours, a temporal stretching that resonates with missing time accounts from earlier abduction narratives. The physical and emotional reactions recorded during police interviews, shivering, panic, tears, were not theatrics. They were behaviors observed and documented by trained officers, who later noted the men's profound disorientation. These reactions, combined with the precise descriptions of the craft and beings, lent an authenticity that separated the Pascagoula incident from ordinary anecdotal sightings or second-hand reports. The FBI's involvement added another layer of rigor to the case. Agents interviewed the men, producing detailed reports that included sketches, verbatim transcripts, and notes on emotional state. The documents reveal that the Bureau was interested less in validating extraterrestrial claims than in assessing the credibility of the witnesses and the potential social impact of their account. Agents documented Hickson's insistence that he had felt paralyzed at one point, unable to resist the being's guidance, and Parker's repeated reference to the buzzing sound that had filled the air. These details were catalogued with clinical neutrality, yet they preserve the essence of the encounter, a confrontation with an unknown presence so compelling that trained authorities could not dismiss it outright. The incident also stands out because it involved multiple witnesses who were unrelated, of different ages, and from different social backgrounds, yet their narratives were astonishingly aligned. This factor increased the investigative weight. Unlike cases involving solitary witnesses or long-lost memories, Pascagoula presented a scenario in which two men with no prior connection experienced the same sequence of events simultaneously. Investigators were thus faced with an unusual evidentiary situation: corroboration between independent accounts, recorded under duress, with a consistent depiction of beings and craft. From a law enforcement perspective, it demanded serious attention. Beyond witness credibility, the physical environment added subtle but telling support. The riverbank was undisturbed except for their boat and equipment, ruling out elaborate hoax setups, and neighbors who observed the men afterward reported an unusual state of agitation. Hickson's wife noted visible anxiety and confusion when he returned home, an emotional residue mirrored in Parker's own recounting. The alignment between the men's testimony, third-party observation, and the official recording procedures lent a rare coherence to a case that might otherwise have been dismissed as a misperception or fabrication. The broader significance of the Pascagoula incident lies in its integration into official and archival processes. Unlike many civilian claims of abduction, which might circulate in UFO newsletters or reach military investigators only indirectly, Hickson and Parker's encounter entered multiple formal channels. Police reports, FBI transcripts, and interviews were later declassified, revealing that authorities had grappled with a phenomenon that did not conform to standard explanations. In the files, one finds meticulous attention to behavioral cues, environmental conditions, and sequence of events, reflecting a bureaucratic effort to maintain objectivity while acknowledging that the event defied ordinary reasoning. One striking aspect of the documentation is the way fear itself is preserved as part of the record. Unlike many reports that focus solely on observable phenomena, lights, movements, radar readings, these files make clear that terror, paralysis, and emotional overwhelm are legitimate components of abduction experiences. Investigators noted that the men's responses were involuntary, and they appear repeatedly in transcripts and memos, captured in real time by officials who had no incentive to exaggerate. In this sense, the Pascagoula files provide a bridge between personal subjective experience and the impartial recording standards of law enforcement and federal authorities. The encounter's influence on later cases is notable as well. Researchers examining the evolution of abduction reports often cite Pascagoula as a template for fear and physical interaction. Elements such as immobilization, examination, and the sensory impressions of sound, light, and movement recur in reports throughout the 1970s and beyond. It demonstrates that abduction phenomena, when they intersect with credible observation and official documentation, cannot be easily categorized as private delusion. Instead, they enter a domain where government archives and civilian experiences intersect, creating a durable historical record that continues to intrigue and perplex. Even decades later, Hickson and Parker's recounting resonates with investigators and enthusiasts alike because the files confirm that fear, confusion, and vivid sensory perception were integral to the encounter. Official documentation did not sanitize these responses. It captured the human dimension in parallel with the mechanical or technological claims of the craft and its occupants. The act of recording, archiving, and later declassifying these files illustrates the care with which authorities approached events that could not be readily explained. It also underscores a recurring theme. When ordinary perception meets the extraordinary, bureaucracy becomes a silent witness, preserving the tension between disbelief and undeniable testimony. The Pascagoula incident, therefore, occupies a unique space in the history of alien encounters. It bridges the gap between ordinary civilian experience and formal institutional acknowledgement, demonstrating that even law enforcement and federal agencies could not dismiss credible accounts outright. The declassified files, complete with emotional markers, environmental observations, and witness sketches, provide a rare window into both the encounter itself and the mindset of officials tasked with recording it. They reveal that abduction phenomena, while extraordinary, demand attention not only for their content but for the way they intersect with the mechanisms of authority, documentation, and memory preservation. In sum, the Pascagoula case illustrates how fear, vivid sensory perception, and corroborated testimony come together to create a record that challenges easy explanation. Hickson and Parker's ordeal, preserved in police and FBI files, demonstrates that some encounters transcend anecdote, entering a realm where official acknowledgement, even if cautious, becomes unavoidable. It reminds us that the phenomenon is not only about strange lights or unidentified craft, but also about the very human experience of terror in the presence of the inexplicable, meticulously recorded for posterity in files that would eventually emerge into public view. By the late 1970s, it had become increasingly clear to researchers and historians that UFOs and abduction phenomena were not merely isolated curiosities confined to civilians or the military. Declassified documents from intelligence agencies reveal that the most secretive corridors of power, the CIA in the United States and the KGB in the Soviet Union, had taken note of events that paralleled civilian abduction reports, often with a meticulousness that reflected both fear and strategic concern. In the CIA files, for example, investigators repeatedly catalogued reports from military personnel, pilots, and even ordinary citizens, many of which included abduction-like experiences, missing time, inexplicable movements, and encounters with entities whose descriptions defied any terrestrial taxonomy. The language in these files is strikingly formal, clinical, and cautious, betraying both the disbelief of analysts and the seriousness with which the agency approached potential threats. The CIA's archival approach often involved collecting reports under the guise of assessing potential national security risks. Documents reveal that analysts were concerned not simply with the reality of UFOs, but with the possibility that foreign powers, or domestic manipulators, might exploit the phenomenon to induce panic or confusion. In one series of declassified memos, intelligence officers discuss incidents in which individuals experienced missing time after observing or interacting with strange aerial objects. These cases were cross-referenced with local police reports, Air Force Blue Book files, and meteorological records, in an attempt to identify mundane explanations. Yet the memos repeatedly acknowledge that some reports defied conventional reasoning. Agents noted the emotional trauma of witnesses, and often commented on the consistency of independent accounts, particularly when multiple witnesses described identical sequences of events. In many respects, the CIA's files function as a hybrid between investigative dossier and psychological study, capturing human reaction as rigorously as physical phenomena. Parallel to the American records, the KGB and Soviet intelligence apparatus were collecting their own accounts of encounters with strange objects and potential abductions. Here, the documentation style differed sharply, reflecting both cultural and operational priorities. Soviet officers emphasized surveillance and strategic risk assessment, noting that any unidentified object could represent a covert Western experiment or a technological breakthrough. Declassified KGB files recount incidents in which pilots, border guards, and rural inhabitants reported abrupt disappearances or encounters with beings described as humanoid but otherworldly. In one particularly striking report from the early 1970s, Border guards in Siberia noted an unexplained light descending near a remote research facility. 2 guards disappeared for several hours and were later found in a state of shock, unable to account for the elapsed time. Unlike the CIA, which framed the phenomenon in analytical and psychological terms, the KGB emphasized operational implications. The possibility that the Soviet Union's security perimeter had been compromised, whether by foreign craft or unknown entities. The contrast in record-keeping is telling. In American files, analysts worried about public reaction, potential misinformation, and maintaining plausible deniability. In Soviet files, the fear was operational. What had occurred, who could exploit it, and what unknown technologies were at play. Yet despite these differences, the substance of the accounts was strikingly similar. Missing time, encounters with beings, strange craft, and psychological or physiological effects. Both agencies had to grapple with the tension between explaining phenomena through conventional means and documenting the unexplainable for future strategic consideration. Some CIA memos even reference cases in which witnesses' memories could be partially recovered only through techniques that resemble hypnosis or deep interviewing. While the agency does not label these experiences as abductions, the descriptions align uncannily with civilian cases. Subjects report being transported aboard a craft, seeing strange humanoid figures, undergoing examinations, and later discovering temporal gaps in their recollection. Analysts express skepticism, but also note the consistency of narratives across different regions and socio-economic backgrounds, highlighting a pattern that could not be fully explained away as fabrication or hysteria. These internal discussions reveal a unique duality in intelligence assessment. The agency could not confirm the presence of extraterrestrial activity, yet neither could it ignore repeated accounts that, if true, implied technologies or forces beyond human comprehension. Soviet files, while less focused on psychological nuance, include documentation of similar patterns. In several KGB transcripts, officers recorded interviews with civilians who reported physical examination-like interactions with unknown beings. In one account, a rural family in Central Asia described seeing a glowing craft land near their home, after which they experienced missing time and bodily symptoms consistent with radiation exposure or other physiological stressors. KGB analysts, constrained by Cold War priorities, were less interested in public reassurance and more focused on assessing whether foreign technological interference was involved. These files underscore a starkly pragmatic approach. Whether or not the phenomenon was extraterrestrial mattered less than the potential risk it posed to national infrastructure and the possibility of intelligence compromise. Interestingly, some CIA files acknowledge the Soviet perspective, comparing incidents reported in both countries and noting similarities despite cultural, linguistic, and political differences. Analysts were aware that these experiences were being catalogued in multiple nations, suggesting a phenomenon that transcended borders. Declassified correspondence within the CIA discusses patterns in missing time, descriptions of beings, and physical traces such as skin burns or indentations, details mirrored in KGB documentation. Even when framed through the lens of operational security, the resonance between American and Soviet accounts lent credibility to the notion that the phenomenon had a recurring structure and was not merely localized folklore. Both agencies also shared a hesitancy to publish or openly discuss these cases. In American records, the CIA frequently redacted witness names, locations, and technical details, citing concerns about national security and the potential for public panic. In Soviet files, redactions often masked the identity of military personnel or classified installation locations. Despite these precautions, the patterns within the documents are discernible: repeated abduction-like scenarios, multiple witnesses, physical effects, and temporal anomalies. The very act of preserving these accounts, even in a highly compartmentalized and coded format, signals an acknowledgement that the events warranted serious consideration, regardless of interpretation. The strategic caution evident in both sets of files also reflects an understanding that the phenomenon could be misused. In American documents, analysts worried that an organized disinformation campaign could exploit reports of abductions, potentially undermining public confidence or masking foreign experiments. In Soviet files, officers feared that unknown aerial phenomena near sensitive installations could be reconnaissance or technological probes. These parallel concerns shaped how each government documented the events. Meticulous recording, preservation of witness testimony, and careful cross-referencing with other known incidents. The intelligence emphasis on methodical cataloging mirrors the bureaucratic ethos of military documentation seen in prior sections, but in this context, it also highlights a geopolitical dimension, fear of the unknown coupled with a need for strategic readiness. Perhaps most intriguing are the rare occasions in which the files hint at outright curiosity or bewilderment. In some CIA memos, analysts admit to being perplexed by witnesses who describe experiences with no obvious terrestrial explanation. They note that while no evidence confirms extraterrestrial activity, the regularity of certain features, beings with humanoid characteristics, missing time, and interaction with technology, cannot be ignored. Likewise, in KGB documents, officers remark on the difficulty of reconciling the accounts with known atmospheric or technological phenomena. In both cases, the documents capture the tension between disbelief and documentation, between operational prudence and the undeniable strangeness of the accounts. When reviewed together, CIA and KGB files create a remarkable mosaic. They demonstrate that across cultural, ideological, and political divides, intelligence agencies were grappling with phenomena that challenged conventional explanation. The accounts, whether framed as abduction-like or classified under operational anomalies, show consistency: missing time, humanoid figures, technological environments, and physiological or psychological effects on witnesses. These similarities suggest that the phenomenon was treated not merely as folklore, but as an emergent pattern worthy of careful observation, cataloguing, and cross-national comparison. Ultimately, the declassified files from both superpowers reveal that the history of alien encounters is not just a matter of sensational headlines or civilian testimony. It is also a record of serious institutional attention, a story of governments documenting the inexplicable while balancing fear, security, and strategic interest. The CIA and KGB may have approached their tasks differently, one through a lens of psychological analysis, the other through operational vigilance. But in both cases, the pattern of encounters, missing time, and abduction-like phenomena was preserved with remarkable care. The result is an archival legacy that continues to intrigue researchers, demonstrating that behind the veil of secrecy, even the most powerful governments could not entirely dismiss the unexplainable. Across the landscape of declassified UFO files, one theme emerges with striking consistency: missing time. Whether recorded in the meticulous CIA memos, the KGB operational dossiers, or military flight logs, there are repeated instances in which individuals, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, vanish for hours, or even days, without explanation. In every case, witnesses report a period of unconsciousness or disorientation that cannot be accounted for by conventional means, leaving official investigators with only fragments of testimony, physical evidence, or corroborating documentation. The persistence of missing time accounts across decades, continents, and social contexts makes them one of the most compelling and puzzling motifs in the study of abduction phenomena. American archives reveal missing time events with remarkable regularity. In the mid-1960s, declassified Blue Book files include statements from civilian witnesses describing abrupt lapses in memory while observing aerial anomalies. One pilot's report noted a blank period of nearly 20 minutes during a routine training flight, during which his altimeter, compass, and radio logs recorded movements he could not recall. Similarly, a series of FBI and local police reports from the late 1970s document civilians returning from rural areas with physical signs, burns, abrasions, and nausea, who could not account for the hours preceding their discovery. These cases, carefully cross-referenced in the files, often included sketches, flight paths, or other recorded data, yet no conventional explanation for the missing intervals could be found. The phenomenon was not confined to the United States. KGB and Soviet intelligence archives record instances in which citizens and border guards reported disappearing for extended periods while in proximity to unusual aerial phenomena. In Siberia, multiple witnesses described waking miles from their original positions, with no recollection of the intervening time. Soviet files detail attempts to reconstruct the events through witness interviews, psychological evaluations, and environmental assessment, only to find that conventional causes, sleepwalking, confusion, or misperception, could not account for the experience. In some cases, missing time coincided with observable environmental anomalies, sudden light displays, electronic interference, or reports of metallic craft in the vicinity. Psychologists have long attempted to account for missing time phenomena, often framing them as memory distortion, trauma response, or hypnagogic episodes. In American files, internal memos reference studies attempting to correlate missing time experiences with psychological profiles, stress levels, and susceptibility to suggestion. Analysts speculated that individuals might unconsciously suppress distressing events, particularly if they involved fear, disorientation, or exposure to unfamiliar stimuli. While these explanations provide a partial framework for understanding altered perception, they fail to address key consistencies observed across independent witnesses. For example, reports often include identical sequences of physical interaction, craft design, or humanoid appearance, even when witnesses have had no contact with one another. This regularity defies purely psychological explanation. The medical dimension further complicates interpretation. Declassified files frequently mention physiological symptoms, burns, lesions, nausea, or radiation-like effects that coincide with periods of missing time. In some cases, military personnel returning from unknown encounters experienced lingering fatigue or memory gaps documented in medical records. These objective indicators suggest that missing time episodes were not simply mental constructs. Something physical, observable, and measurable accompanied them. Analysts repeatedly highlighted the challenge of reconciling objective evidence with incomplete subjective memory, creating a tension that remains unresolved in both civilian and military archives. One of the most striking aspects of missing time cases is their reproducibility across cultures. In Brazil, Antonio Vilas Boas's account from 1957 included a clear interval during which he was aboard a craft and later returned to his field, with hours effectively erased from his conscious recollection. Decades later, Barney and Betty Hill's experience in New Hampshire reflected a remarkably similar pattern. Missing time coincided with their alleged abduction, and hypnotic regression was necessary to reconstruct the events. Even the Pascagoula incident shows echoes of this phenomenon, as Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker struggled to reconcile the sequence of events during their encounter with a craft. Across American, Brazilian, and European files, the pattern remains. Independent witnesses report an unexplained temporal gap, often accompanied by observation of a craft or beings, yet conventional clocks, logs, or environmental indicators confirm that time has elapsed differently than perceived. Foreign archives offer additional examples. In the United Kingdom, Air Ministry reports from the 1950s and 1960s catalogued cases in which civilians reported lost hours after observing lights or objects in the sky. These files, though less detailed than American Blue Book records, reveal that investigators noted the uncanny similarity of missing time reports across unrelated individuals and different geographic locations. In France and Germany, UFO research agencies documented analogous lapses, often coinciding with descriptions of small humanoid figures or metallic craft. Even when dismissed publicly as misperception or hysteria, the internal records preserved the anomaly, reflecting a persistent acknowledgement that the phenomenon could not be fully explained away. The recurring structure of missing time episodes is notable. Witnesses typically report initial observation of an unusual light or craft, followed by a sudden loss of control or unconsciousness. Upon regaining awareness, individuals often find themselves in a different location, experiencing disorientation, fatigue, or minor physical effects. In some cases, corroborating evidence, such as radar recordings, flight logs, or third-party observation, aligns with the interval, providing an external confirmation that time has indeed passed in a way that the witness cannot recall. The consistency of this pattern across nations, decades, and socio-economic backgrounds challenges purely psychosomatic interpretations and suggests an underlying phenomenon with predictable, repeatable features. Psychologists attempting to reconcile these events with contemporary theory face a persistent dilemma. Traditional frameworks such as memory suppression, hypnosis-induced confabulation, or stress-related temporal distortion account for some elements, but they cannot explain physical corroboration or cross-witness consistency. Indeed, internal CIA and KGB memos reflect a similar struggle. Intelligence analysts repeatedly note the problematic alignment of subjective and objective evidence and the challenge of interpreting missing time reports without assuming either fabrication or error. The files often conclude with language designed to preserve ambiguity. Investigators acknowledge patterns, note their persistence, and refrain from definitive interpretation. This tension underscores both the allure and the frustration of missing time phenomena. In sum, the recurring pattern of disappearing hours or days across declassified reports from multiple nations, cultures, and investigative frameworks demonstrates that missing time is more than an anecdotal curiosity. It is a persistent motif linking civilian, military, and intelligence encounters. Psychologists may propose mechanisms of memory distortion, trauma response, or cognitive lapse, but the corroborated, measurable, and internationally documented cases continue to defy straightforward explanation. From the fields of Brazil to the highways of New Hampshire, from Mississippi riverbanks to Siberian border posts, missing time phenomena remain a central, enigmatic thread in the tapestry of alien encounters recorded by human witnesses and preserved in official files. As the phenomenon of missing time became a recurring motif in declassified reports, another pattern began to emerge, one that captured the attention of both civilian researchers and government agencies alike: abductions involving entire groups. Unlike solitary experiences, which could be dismissed as individual misperception or psychological anomaly, cases in which multiple witnesses simultaneously reported abduction-like phenomena created a level of evidentiary weight that could not be easily ignored. Across decades and continents, files reveal situations in which friends, co-workers, families, and even military units experienced the inexplicable together, often under circumstances that lent credibility to their accounts precisely because no single witness could be accused of fabrication. One of the earliest recorded multi-witness abductions involved the 1966 Westall incident in Australia, where dozens of students and teachers reportedly observed a saucer-shaped object descend near their school. Although some official reports treated the event as a misidentification of conventional aircraft, declassified documents note that several individuals independently reported a temporary disappearance of time or an altered perception of events. These files preserve the alignment of observations. Multiple students noted a strange metallic object, a low humming sound, and a sudden, disorienting sensation that left them uncertain of how much time had passed. The consistency of their recollections, despite differences in age and background, marked a significant departure from solitary abduction accounts, compelling researchers to document the phenomenon more seriously. Similar patterns are present in U.S. military and civilian archives. For example, Project Blue Book includes reports in which entire groups of airmen observed luminous craft during training exercises, with several participants experiencing disorientation or missing time concurrently. Radar logs and corroborating testimony from flight control officers provided tangible evidence that multiple individuals had observed the same event, often under controlled conditions where ordinary misperception would be unlikely. These multi-witness reports introduced a new challenge for analysts. They could no longer dismiss anomalies as the result of a single unreliable memory, and the consistent patterns across witnesses made the phenomenon harder to explain by conventional psychological or environmental causes. One of the most compelling multi-witness cases emerged during the Rendlesham Forest incident in December 1980. Multiple U.S. Air Force personnel reported observing strange lights in the forest over several nights, and several witnesses described encountering a craft and its occupants. Declassified memos and internal reports document the shared experience of fear, sensory perception of the craft's metallic surface, and even minor physiological effects, such as tingling sensations or burns on the skin. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt's memo explicitly notes that these accounts were cross-verified among different airmen, underscoring the collective nature of the encounter. The simultaneous reporting of missing time, unexplainable lights, and tactile interactions elevated the credibility of the incident in the eyes of investigators and contributed to its enduring place in UFO history. Multi-witness abduction reports are not confined to military contexts. Civilian cases often reveal families or groups of friends experiencing the phenomenon together. In one 1970s declassified report from rural France, a family of 4 described a nighttime encounter in which a luminous craft hovered above their farm. All 4 individuals reported being lifted from the ground and experiencing a period during which the sequence of events became blurred. The file meticulously recorded each witness's testimony, noting both similarities and minor divergences in perception. Analysts were particularly struck by the convergence of key details: physical sensations, visual descriptions, and temporal distortion, across witnesses who had no prior incentive to fabricate the story. Governments paid special attention to multi-witness encounters for several reasons. First, the potential for public scrutiny increased exponentially when multiple individuals were involved. A single civilian account could be dismissed as imagination, but corroborated experiences were more difficult to discredit. Second, from a strategic perspective, these incidents raised concerns about national security. If multiple personnel or civilians experienced disorientation or altered states during encounters with unknown craft, the potential for compromised operations or safety became a practical issue. Finally, intelligence agencies recognized that multi-witness events often produced richer, more detailed data than solitary cases, allowing analysts to cross-reference observations, evaluate consistency, and assess physical or environmental effects with greater precision. A notable example in American files involves a small group of construction workers in the late 1970s who reported a sudden bright light and subsequent missing time while working at a remote site in Nevada. Multiple workers described seeing a metallic craft and humanoid figures, and several documented minor burns and disorientation. Declassified reports note that local law enforcement corroborated the workers' observations with independent witnesses from a nearby highway, creating a web of accounts that could not be easily attributed to fabrication. The files reflect a rare but significant pattern. When multiple people experienced the phenomenon simultaneously, the resulting documentation often included objective physical traces, such as scorched vegetation or disrupted soil, further reinforcing the credibility of the reports. The consistency of details among witnesses is particularly striking in these group abduction files. Across different continents and decades, declassified documents preserve recurring elements: the sudden appearance of a craft, sensory disorientation, temporal lapses, physical examinations or interactions with beings, and post-event confusion or fear. In some cases, psychological assessments were conducted on multiple witnesses to evaluate shared trauma or suggestibility, and analysts consistently observed that while minor perceptual differences existed, the core events aligned remarkably well. These correlations make group abductions a central focus for researchers attempting to identify patterns or rules governing the phenomenon. The psychological dimension is complex. In individual abduction cases, memory distortion or confabulation is often cited as an explanation. In multi-witness encounters, these arguments are far less persuasive, particularly when the witnesses are unrelated or lack a common frame of reference. Intelligence files reflect this tension. Analysts recognized that multiple independent accounts converging on the same sequence of events represented a category of evidence that could not be easily dismissed, even when extraordinary. Consequently, agencies often preserve these files with heightened scrutiny, noting physical traces, corroborating environmental evidence, and detailed witness statements for future cross-analysis. Multi-witness incidents also illustrate the social and cultural dynamics of abduction phenomena. In civilian communities, Group experiences often generated local notoriety and media attention, which in turn prompted law enforcement and federal agencies to respond more formally. In military contexts, shared encounters heightened operational concern, as multiple personnel simultaneously reporting missing time or sensory anomalies posed potential risks to training, security, or mission readiness. In both cases, the involvement of multiple witnesses elevated the stakes, ensuring that these incidents were documented with care and preserved in official files for decades. Ultimately, the study of multi-witness abduction files underscores a fundamental principle. When several people experience the same extraordinary event simultaneously, the phenomenon enters a realm where personal anecdote intersects with institutional record. Governments, whether for strategic, legal, or procedural reasons, could not ignore the corroborated experiences. Across declassified archives from the United States, Europe, and other regions, group abductions consistently demonstrate the same hallmarks as solitary cases: missing time, contact with craft or beings, and physiological or psychological effects. Yet the presence of multiple witnesses intensifies credibility, elevates the anomaly, and compels official preservation. While the psychological and temporal dimensions of abduction accounts, missing time, memory lapses, and multi-witness corroboration capture much attention, a subset of declassified files points to a more tangible, physical aspect: the presence of burns, scars, and even alleged implants in abductees. These records reveal that for some witnesses, encounters with unknown craft and beings left measurable marks on the body, often documented by medical professionals and preserved in official reports. The attention given to these cases underscores the dual challenge faced by authorities: how to reconcile concrete, observable phenomena with the absence of a conventional explanation. One of the earliest examples appears in Project Blue Book files, where civilians reported skin burns or circular lesions following encounters with unidentified aerial objects. In several cases, victims were referred to local hospitals or military doctors for examination. Physicians noted unusual patterns of discoloration, raised tissue, or puncture-like marks, sometimes circular and symmetrical, suggesting precision rather than accidental injury. Although skeptics argued that such injuries could be self-inflicted or the result of mundane accidents, the consistency across multiple reports, combined with corroborating witness testimony of craft contact, elevated these incidents in official documentation. Files frequently note that doctors were perplexed. They could describe the physical anomalies, but no known medical condition could fully account for the marks or their patterns. The Hickson-Parker incident at Pascagoula also includes physical evidence, albeit less invasive than implants. Declassified police and FBI reports document minor abrasions and stress-related physiological effects observed after the encounter. These records preserve both objective and subjective information. The officers noted the men's tremors, elevated heart rates, and visible cuts on the hands and arms, while the men themselves described sensations of being touched by unfamiliar mechanical appendages aboard the craft. The combination of observed injury and first-person testimony created a layered record in which physical reality intersected with psychological impact, and these entries highlight the careful attention investigators paid to any corporeal anomalies. More controversial, and perhaps more compelling, are cases documenting alleged implants. Some abductees reported feeling foreign objects embedded in their bodies, often following unexplained encounters with craft. In declassified files from the 1970s and 1980s, FBI and CIA records note that several individuals underwent X-rays or surgical removal of these objects, which were subsequently examined by physicians. In some reports, doctors could confirm the presence of small, metallic devices, though their origin remained inexplicable. Laboratory analysis occasionally detected unusual compositions, elements or alloys not commonly used in consumer or medical products. While these cases are rare and the documentation is often heavily redacted, the files preserve the fact that medical professionals, law enforcement, and intelligence agencies took the claims seriously enough to record them in official archives. The intersection of government skepticism and physical evidence is a recurrent theme. Analysts were generally cautious, aware that many claims could be exaggerated, misinterpreted, or fabricated. Yet the presence of observable anomalies, documented by trained medical personnel, forced a delicate balance. Files repeatedly note that investigators could not endorse extraterrestrial causation, but neither could they dismiss the evidence outright. This tension is evident in reports containing both clinical terminology and explicit acknowledgement of witnesses' experiences, reflecting a methodology designed to maintain objectivity while preserving the strangeness of the phenomenon. In some cases, physical evidence extended beyond burns or implants. Reports mention temporary paralysis, unusual bruising patterns, and unexplained skin markings that appeared in shapes or configurations inconsistent with known injuries. Certain military and civilian files reference trace elements of radiation, magnetic disruption, or local environmental anomalies coinciding with reported encounters. The documentation is precise. Field notes, hospital reports, and laboratory tests are cross-referenced with witness statements and environmental measurements. In these instances, physical evidence was treated not as proof of extraterrestrial visitation, but as a legitimate anomaly requiring archival preservation and further study. The Nimitz encounters of 2004 also demonstrate the modern relevance of physical anomalies in official documentation. While primarily known for radar and sensor data, several Navy pilots reported physiological effects, disorientation, visual disturbances, and temporary blackouts during interactions with tic-tac-shaped objects. These observations were logged in official flight and intelligence reports, creating a bridge between perceptual experiences and measurable physical responses. Though declassified documents do not confirm implants or direct contact, they demonstrate the broader spectrum of physical evidence considered significant by military and intelligence authorities. Another illustrative example is the Betty and Barney Hill case, where hypnosis-assisted recall revealed subtle, puncture-like marks that were examined by medical personnel. Files indicate that Dr. Benjamin Simon, a psychiatrist assisting with the investigation, noted unusual physical traces alongside psychological assessments. The documentation preserved in Air Force and FBI files shows that even when direct medical evidence was minimal, investigators prioritized thorough recording, illustrating an institutional awareness that corporeal anomalies, however subtle, could provide critical insights into the abduction experience. International archives reinforce the importance of physical evidence. In declassified Soviet and European records, witnesses reported minor injuries, circular lesions, or transient burns following encounters. While some governments dismissed these claims publicly, the internal documentation retained detailed medical observations, photographs, and sketches. In several Soviet KGB files, officers noted that individuals returning from encounters appeared physically altered, prompting medical evaluation and surveillance. These records highlight a consistent approach. Whether in America, Europe, or the USSR, physical anomalies were meticulously recorded, often with collaboration between law enforcement and medical professionals, even when the cause remained unknown. The careful preservation of physical evidence underscores the broader investigative philosophy of government agencies. By documenting burns, scars, and implants, officials could create a record that was independent of subjective testimony alone. This dual recording, combining witness accounts with tangible anomalies, served multiple purposes. It allowed analysts to assess credibility, establish continuity across cases, and create archives that could be revisited as new investigative techniques or scientific understanding emerged. Declassified files repeatedly emphasize this layered methodology, maintain objectivity, document anomalies, and leave interpretation open while preserving evidence for future analysis. Ultimately, the physical dimension of abduction reports bridges the subjective and the empirical. It anchors missing time experiences, psychological reactions, and group corroborations in a tangible reality that cannot be ignored. Whether in the form of burns, lesions, temporary paralysis, or alleged implants, physical evidence lent weight to otherwise intangible phenomena. Government files reveal the tension inherent in these encounters. Investigators sought rational explanations, yet consistently recorded anomalies that defied conventional understanding. By balancing skepticism with careful documentation, authorities created an archival record that continues to challenge researchers, suggesting that whatever was occurring left traces not only on memory and perception, but on the human body itself. As physical evidence of abduction, burns, scars, and alleged implants began to accumulate in declassified files, another dimension emerged that brought the phenomenon into the intersecting realm of psychology and state experimentation. Hypnosis, mind control, and governmental research into the human mind. From the 1950s onward, the CIA's MKUltra program and similar studies in other countries sought to explore the limits of memory, perception, and suggestion, often overlapping in methodology with the investigation of UFO encounters. Abduction reports, particularly those involving missing time, sensory alteration, or repetitive trauma, presented a tantalizing opportunity for analysts to examine whether these experiences were purely psychological, induced, or even potentially weaponized. The convergence of abduction narratives and classified psychological experiments is preserved in chilling detail across American and foreign archives, revealing a dimension of government involvement rarely acknowledged in public discussions of UFO phenomena. Hypnosis became a critical tool in this intersection. Many abductees who experienced missing time or partial amnesia were subjected to regression therapy, often conducted by psychologists or psychiatrists collaborating with government programs. In the Barney and Betty Hill case, for instance, hypnotic sessions revealed intricate details of their experience, including star maps, examination procedures, and descriptions of humanoid beings, details that neither could recall consciously at the time of initial reporting. Declassified Air Force and FBI files preserve transcripts of these sessions, which often recorded both the content of the recovered memories and the physical and emotional reactions of the subjects. Analysts noted the consistency of certain elements, yet also expressed caution, recognizing that hypnotic suggestion could introduce distortions. Nevertheless, the files illustrate that hypnosis was not merely a clinical curiosity. It became a methodological tool to extract information from those whose consciousness appeared disrupted by abduction experiences. MKUltra, the CIA's notorious mind control program, loomed in the background of these studies. Declassified documents reveal experiments involving sensory deprivation, hallucinogenic substances, and suggestibility tests, all designed to probe the boundaries of memory and perception. Abduction reports intersected with this research in ways that remain striking. Some witnesses who underwent hypnotic regression displayed recollections resembling procedural aspects of MKUltra experimentation, including examinations, invasive procedures, and unexplainable control over perception of time. The overlap is not absolute, but files preserve a remarkable resonance. Both abductee accounts and MKUltra records reflect a systematic interest in human consciousness, the manipulation of memory, and the extraction of information that may not have been consciously accessible to the subject. Government analysts debated the implications of this overlap. Internal CIA memos and FBI notes frequently discuss whether abduction phenomena were naturally occurring psychological events, misinterpreted environmental stimuli, or artificially induced through experimentation, either domestic or foreign. Some documents explore the possibility that adversarial nations might employ techniques similar to MKUltra to manipulate perception or implant false memories. Others raise the question of whether apparent abduction experiences could be leveraged as a form of covert psychological weapon, either to destabilize communities or to test human responses to extraordinary stimuli. The files reflect a careful, sometimes cautious approach. Officials meticulously documented every hypnotic session, medical examination, and psychological evaluation, creating a layered record that preserved both subjective testimony and investigative skepticism. The hypnotic sessions themselves often reveal the uncanny nature of abduction experiences. Subjects report sensations of being paralyzed, transported, or examined aboard craft, frequently describing beings with humanoid but inhuman features. The sessions preserve minute details, textures, smells, sounds, and movements, often verified across multiple witnesses. In some declassified CIA and Air Force files, analysts highlight the consistency of these accounts, noting that independent subjects produced overlapping descriptions despite having no prior contact. These observations reinforced a persistent theme in government records. Whether through ordinary psychological mechanisms or extraordinary intervention, abductees reported experiences that defied conventional explanation, compelling documentation, and cautious investigation. International archives demonstrate that the psychological dimension was not confined to the United States. Soviet KGB and Eastern Bloc intelligence reports note cases in which individuals reported missing time, unexplainable abduction, or involuntary sensory alterations. In several files, medical officers were tasked with documenting psychological states, physiological responses, and memory recovery, often employing techniques analogous to Western hypnosis. While these archives rarely connect the phenomenon explicitly to mind control experimentation, the methods overlap: assessment of recall under duress, evaluation of memory gaps, and documentation of trauma-induced behavior. These parallels suggest a shared recognition among governments that the abduction phenomenon intersected with the study of human consciousness in ways both operationally relevant and scientifically confounding. Psychologists involved in analyzing these cases often wrestled with profound uncertainty. Files preserve debates over the validity of hypnotically recovered memories, the influence of suggestion, and the reliability of recall under stress. Some analysts posited that abduction experiences could be understood as dissociative episodes, perhaps triggered by stress or trauma, and subsequently amplified by hypnosis. Others observed that certain details, technical descriptions of craft, environmental interactions, or physical effects, remained consistent across witnesses, challenging purely psychological explanations. The tension between skepticism and documentation is evident throughout the declassified records. Investigators carefully note anomalies, record subjective experience, and avoid conclusive interpretation, leaving future analysts to grapple with the unresolved intersection of mind, body, and the unknown. Some cases suggest that governments actively explored whether abduction phenomena could be weaponized. In CIA memos, analysts consider the potential for inducing memory lapses, hallucinations, or trauma responses as a means of testing human resilience or extracting information. The documents stop short of confirming operational use of extraterrestrial phenomena, yet they reveal that officials were sufficiently concerned about psychological effects to maintain extensive records. Similarly, KGB files reflect an awareness that sudden, disorienting encounters, whether attributed to craft or environmental manipulation, could have implications for national security or the management of human behavior under stress. In both contexts, hypnosis and related psychological techniques provided a framework for exploring the boundaries of perception, memory, and compliance. The layering of these dimensions, physical evidence, group corroboration, missing time, and hypnotically recovered memory, creates a comprehensive yet unsettling picture. Declassified files show that governments recognize the multiplicity of factors involved in abduction phenomena: human consciousness, environmental observation, physical interaction, and potential manipulation. Hypnosis, mind control experiments, and psychological assessment were not ancillary but integral to understanding how these experiences could be studied, documented, and, in some scenarios, possibly applied for operational purposes. The files preserve this tension in striking detail. Meticulous records of hypnotic sessions sit alongside medical examinations and witness interviews, reflecting both rigorous methodology and the pervasive uncertainty surrounding the phenomena. In sum, the intersection of abduction reports with hypnosis and classified psychological experimentation illuminates a rarely acknowledged aspect of UFO history. Declassified archives reveal that governments approached the phenomenon from multiple angles: as potential psychological events, operationally relevant anomalies, and subjects for experimental study. Hypnosis provided a tool for memory recovery, while MKUltra-style experimentation offered frameworks for evaluating perception, recall, and susceptibility to suggestion. Across the files, one sees a repeated pattern, careful documentation, balanced skepticism, and an enduring acknowledgement that certain phenomena remained beyond conventional understanding. These records suggest that human consciousness itself became a frontier of investigation, with abduction phenomena at the mysterious nexus of observation, analysis, and unexplained experience. As the study of abductions evolved through the meticulous preservation of U.S. files, a broader and more compelling pattern emerged. The phenomenon was not confined to North America. Across Europe, South America, Asia, and Africa, declassified government archives reveal encounters that mirror the missing time, physical anomalies, and multi-witness corroboration documented in American cases. The global distribution of abduction reports underscores a critical point. The phenomenon transcended national borders, cultures, and political systems, suggesting a pattern that drew the attention of governments worldwide. For intelligence agencies, military authorities, and researchers, these encounters were far from local folklore. They represented a recurring enigma that demanded documentation, analysis, and sometimes discreet investigation. In Britain, the Ministry of Defence, MOD, maintained extensive files on unidentified aerial phenomena throughout the second half of the 20th century. Declassified records reveal hundreds of civilian and military reports, some of which included descriptions of missing time, close encounters with craft, and humanoid beings. One notable case involved a small village in southern England, where multiple residents reported being taken aboard a craft, experiencing time lapses, and observing beings whose appearance defied earthly norms. Internal MOD memos highlight the caution with which these reports were handled. While publicly dismissed as misperception or hysteria, the files demonstrate careful cross-referencing of witness testimony, local police records, and environmental data. Analysts noted that the consistency of these reports across unrelated individuals lent credibility to the accounts, compelling the agency to retain them for potential future investigation. South America, particularly Brazil and Argentina, provides some of the most striking examples of abduction cases, often involving intensive local and military scrutiny. Antonio Villas-Boas' 1957 experience in Brazil was the first widely reported case of an alien abduction, yet declassified Brazilian military files reveal that his account was taken seriously by local authorities, including documentation of his physical and psychological state following the encounter. Subsequent decades produced additional cases. Families and agricultural workers reported sudden disappearances, missing time, and physical traces upon return. Military involvement in some cases was extensive, with officers conducting site investigations, environmental measurements, and medical examinations. These files reveal a pattern similar to U.S. investigations. Initial skepticism tempered by meticulous documentation of anomalies that could not be explained through conventional means. In Argentina, declassified military archives include accounts of group encounters, where multiple witnesses simultaneously reported abduction-like phenomena. One 1970s report details a family of 4 who, while traveling through a remote area, observed a glowing craft descend and felt a sudden loss of consciousness. Upon regaining awareness, they found themselves several miles from their original location, with disorientation and minor physical effects. Military and police reports carefully catalogued the event, noting environmental conditions, witness statements, and physical anomalies. Analysts emphasized the importance of cross-checking testimony, particularly when multiple witnesses independently described identical sequences of events, echoing patterns observed in both American and Brazilian records. Asian cases, though less frequently discussed in Western literature, appear in declassified government and military documents preserved in Japan, India, and China. In Japan, several rural reports from the 1970s describe missing time and humanoid encounters during nighttime observations of luminous aerial objects. Government files reveal that local authorities investigated these events, documenting witness testimony, physical evidence, and environmental anomalies. In India, military files include accounts from border patrols and isolated villages, noting sudden disappearances, sensory disorientation, and unexplained craft sightings. Chinese archives, though largely inaccessible until recent years, have begun to release accounts from rural communities and military units describing simultaneous observation of unusual objects and altered perception of time, suggesting that the phenomenon was monitored, recorded, and taken seriously even under highly controlled bureaucratic systems. African reports, while often less formalized in documentation, are preserved in police, intelligence, and local governmental archives. In South Africa, Namibia, and the Congo, rural witnesses reported encounters with luminous craft, missing time, and minor physical effects such as burns or lesions. Declassified local police files reveal that investigators sometimes collaborated with military officers to assess environmental effects, including unusual soil disruption, electromagnetic anomalies, and corroborating observations from nearby villages. These accounts, while less frequent than American or European reports, reflect a persistent global pattern. Individuals, sometimes in groups, experiencing a temporally and physically disruptive encounter with unexplained phenomena. Cross-cultural analysis of these global cases reveals remarkable consistencies. Despite differences in geography, language, and cultural interpretation, the reports often share common elements: luminous or metallic craft, humanoid entities, missing time, physical effects, and, occasionally, post-encounter trauma or confusion. These recurring motifs suggest a phenomenon with structural regularity, captured across multiple nations by diverse governmental bodies. Declassified files preserve these details meticulously, indicating that intelligence agencies, police departments, and military authorities recognized both the strangeness of the phenomenon and the potential implications for public safety, operational integrity, and scientific study. One particularly compelling example from the United Kingdom illustrates the intersection of civilian and military observation. In the early 1980s, multiple witnesses in a rural area reported a sudden craft landing and the subsequent abduction of 2 individuals. MOD files include police records, local environmental assessments, and post-encounter medical notes, reflecting the systematic approach to documentation. The event was ultimately classified as unexplained, yet the thoroughness of the investigation demonstrates the seriousness with which multiple witnesses and tangible physical evidence were treated. Analysts noted that corroborating accounts from unrelated observers strengthened the credibility of the report and provided a precedent for cross-referencing civilian and official documentation in other countries. In Brazil, the repeated documentation of abductions by both civilians and military personnel highlights a unique intensity of governmental engagement. Files show that witnesses were interviewed multiple times, medical examinations were conducted, and environmental traces were meticulously recorded. Analysts observed consistent elements: missing time, psychological disorientation, tactile interaction with unknown entities, and minor physical injuries. The alignment of civilian and military observations, combined with thorough archival preservation, creates a compelling body of evidence suggesting that abductions were considered a tangible phenomenon warranting serious attention, rather than mere cultural storytelling or mass hysteria. South American multi-witness files also demonstrate why governments paid special attention to these encounters. The simultaneous observation by multiple individuals, sometimes families, groups of workers, or military units, created a level of evidentiary credibility that single witness cases could not achieve. Declassified military reports from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay reflect careful investigation, including cross-examination of testimony, environmental documentation, and, in some instances, medical evaluation. Analysts noted that patterns in these multi-witness experiences mirrored those recorded in the United States, reinforcing the notion that abduction phenomena were not geographically isolated, but rather a global occurrence with recurrent characteristics. Asian and African archives, though often less extensive, reveal a broader, worldwide awareness of the phenomenon. In Japan, China, India, and South Africa, intelligence and military records highlight efforts to document witness testimony, corroborate physical effects, and track recurrent anomalies. While cultural interpretation varied, sometimes framed through religious or mythological lenses, the structural details of encounters remained remarkably consistent. Witnesses reported similar experiences of missing time, perception of strange beings, and temporary physical or psychological effects. These global parallels suggest that abduction phenomena transcended local folklore, becoming a matter of institutional concern and methodical recording across nations. Ultimately, the global perspective reframes the narrative of alien abductions. No longer confined to American hysteria, Blue Book files, or individual media accounts, abductions appear in the bureaucratic and investigative records of multiple continents, cultures, and political systems. Whether through Britain's Ministry of Defense, South American military files, or Asian and African intelligence archives, governments maintained detailed records, cross-referenced accounts, and documented physical, psychological, and environmental effects. The evidence suggests that authorities recognized the phenomenon's persistence, structural consistency, and potential operational significance, leading to careful preservation even when public acknowledgement remained minimal. Viewed collectively, these global archives confirm a fundamental truth: abduction phenomena were not simply an American obsession or a cultural quirk. Across continents, witnesses experienced similar disruptions of time, contact with entities, and physical anomalies, and governments responded with measured documentation, investigative rigor, and institutional caution. Declassified files reveal that the phenomenon was monitored, preserved, and studied worldwide, demonstrating that alien abduction accounts were part of a shared human experience, one that challenged conventional understanding and compelled serious attention from authorities regardless of geography or culture. Even as the global picture of abductions began to take shape, a persistent undercurrent in the declassified files is clear: skepticism. Across decades of documentation, intelligence agencies, military officers, and government investigators repeatedly grappled with the tension between extraordinary witness claims and the inherent implausibility of such events. Many reports were treated with caution, disbelief, or outright dismissal, yet, curiously, the files themselves were preserved with meticulous care, revealing that even skeptical officials recognized the importance of maintaining a record of phenomena they could not entirely explain. Within U.S. Air Force and CIA archives, analysts frequently annotated reports with cautionary remarks, emphasizing potential misperception, memory distortion, or fabrication. In some Project Blue Book files, civilian witnesses were questioned about the possibility of hoaxes or exaggeration, and psychologists evaluated the mental state of individuals reporting missing time or direct contact with unknown entities. These evaluations often concluded that, while some elements of the accounts could be attributed to stress, hallucination, or suggestibility, there remained details that defied conventional explanation. The dual approach, documenting anomalies while questioning their validity, reflects a fundamental principle that permeates much of the archival record: skepticism did not preclude investigation. Skepticism also extended to the procedural rigor of recording cases. Some files reveal internal debate about resource allocation. Should intelligence officers devote time and manpower to investigating reports that seemed fantastical or the product of mass hysteria? Yet the decision to continue documentation appears repeatedly justified by the very possibility that a subset of cases might contain genuine anomalies. Analysts often noted patterns, such as recurring missing time, cross-witness corroboration, or physical evidence, that could not be easily dismissed, even if other aspects of the report seemed questionable. In effect, the files demonstrate a tension between professional doubt and methodical archival practice, showing that disbelief and thorough documentation were not mutually exclusive but complementary. International files echo this same dynamic. In Britain, Ministry of Defense records frequently describe meetings in which officials debated the credibility of UFO reports. Some officers explicitly labeled cases as pranks, psychological delusions, or misidentified natural phenomena. Yet even in these discussions, memos instruct subordinates to preserve witness statements, environmental observations, and cross-references to similar incidents. South American military archives contain similar reflections. Argentine and Brazilian investigators expressed skepticism about certain civilian claims but nonetheless conducted follow-up interviews, site investigations, and medical examinations. The persistence of documentation, even when doubt prevailed, underscores an institutional understanding that dismissing cases outright could result in the loss of critical patterns or corroborated anomalies. The files also preserve candid acknowledgement of ridicule and bureaucratic frustration. Internal correspondence sometimes notes that witnesses were ridiculed by local authorities or colleagues, or that reporting officers struggled to maintain composure while processing extraordinary accounts. KGB archives similarly record instances where officials considered certain abduction claims laughable or implausible. Nevertheless, even where skepticism was pronounced, the decision to record, archive, and categorize these events persisted, reflecting a professional obligation to retain potentially significant information, regardless of personal belief. Psychological evaluations played a crucial role in balancing skepticism and investigation. Analysts employed psychometric testing, interviews, and stress assessments to distinguish between fabricated claims, mental health issues, and potentially genuine anomalous experiences. Hypnosis, regression therapy, and other memory retrieval techniques were often scrutinized for their suggestive influence, leading some officials to question the reliability of recovered memories. Yet, files consistently preserve the results of these evaluations alongside witness statements, suggesting that the intent was not to discredit but to contextualize the information. Skepticism functioned as a lens through which anomalies could be examined critically without discarding them entirely. A recurring theme in skeptical documentation is the acknowledgement that extraordinary claims could coexist with real anomalies. For example, Project Blue Book files frequently label reports as psychologically improbable or hoax suspected, while simultaneously cataloging physical traces such as burns, scars, or radar anomalies. These dual entries reflect a conscious distinction between evaluating the plausibility of witness interpretation and recording objective or corroborated data. Skepticism thus became a procedural safeguard. It ensured that investigative rigor was maintained while still capturing details that might prove significant if patterns emerged across multiple reports. Even the most incredulous officials recognized that anomalies, however unlikely, required institutional attention. Declassified memos repeatedly emphasize retention, cross-referencing, and archiving, highlighting a culture of cautious openness. In effect, skepticism did not equate to neglect. On the contrary, it fostered a disciplined approach: record first, interpret cautiously, and leave room for the possibility that the unexplained might one day yield meaningful insight. This approach also explains why files often contain meticulous documentation of trivial or inconsistent details. Even when an officer doubted a specific claim, the act of recording preserved data that could illuminate broader patterns in the phenomenon. Skepticism inside the files also serves as a measure of credibility. Investigators consistently distinguished between cases with high degrees of corroboration, multiple witnesses, physical traces, radar confirmation, and those more likely to be the product of imagination or error. By noting doubt explicitly, agencies created a graded system for evaluating evidence, allowing future analysts to prioritize records without discarding potentially relevant material. This methodical skepticism, paradoxically, strengthens the archive. It provides a filter for interpretation while safeguarding the raw data that could reveal genuine anomalies when examined with hindsight. The global context reinforces this dynamic. Across Britain, South America, and Asia, declassified documents reveal that officials frequently confronted tension between disbelief and the need for documentation. Multi-witness cases, recurring missing time phenomena, and physical anomalies compelled preservation even when rational explanations seemed improbable. KGB and MOD files illustrate similar patterns. Investigators labeled certain claims as psychologically implausible while simultaneously cataloging details meticulously. The pattern suggests a consistent principle among governments worldwide. Skepticism was operational, not dismissive, and serve to guide careful, systematic investigation. Ultimately, the files demonstrate that the coexistence of skepticism and documentation is essential to understanding the institutional response to abduction phenomena. Officials could doubt, critique, and question witnesses while preserving every possible detail for future analysis. The skepticism is not a contradiction but a deliberate methodology, reflecting the challenge of reconciling extraordinary claims with empirical investigation. By recording hoaxes, questionable accounts, and psychological evaluations alongside credible reports, agencies created archives that are both cautious and comprehensive, a dual lens capturing the tension between disbelief and the persistent, unexplained reality of abduction phenomena. When one steps back from the individual cases, from solitary reports and multi-witness encounters, and begins to examine the accumulated declassified files as a whole, a striking phenomenon emerges: patterns that defy conventional logic. Across decades, continents, and political systems, certain recurring elements appear with such consistency that they resist simple dismissal. The same types of entities, procedural details, and temporal anomalies repeat with an uncanny regularity, leaving analysts, both governmental and civilian, perplexed. By comparing files from the United States, Britain, South America, Asia, and Africa, these shared motifs illuminate a dimension of the phenomenon that is both systematic and deeply enigmatic. Perhaps the most notable pattern is the appearance of entities across time and geography. Whether in the Hill abduction in New Hampshire, the Villas-Boas case in Brazil, or multiple incidents documented in MOD files, witnesses describe beings of similar morphology. Humanoid forms with large, almond-shaped eyes, slender frames, and subtle but distinct deviations from human physiology. These descriptions appear in countries separated by thousands of miles, and in cultures with no direct contact or shared folklore. The consistency is further reinforced in multi-witness reports, where several individuals independently describe entities with identical proportions, movements, and behavior during the same encounter. Analysts within intelligence agencies often highlighted this phenomenon, noting that while cultural interpretation could explain superficial differences, the core structural similarities were inexplicable by any conventional mechanism of storytelling or hallucination. Procedural patterns also emerge with remarkable clarity. Across the files, abductees repeatedly describe being taken aboard craft, subjected to examination or experimentation, and returned with memory gaps or altered perception. Medical or physical interactions, ranging from tactile probing to the insertion of devices or implants, appear in reports from North America, South America, and Europe. Declassified archives preserve detailed descriptions of these procedures, often corroborated by physical evidence such as burns, scars, or traces of radiation. Even when the precise purpose of these procedures is unclear, the uniformity in sequence, methodology, and effect suggests a highly organized pattern that transcends individual imagination. The recurrence of such procedural details over decades challenges the assumption that these events are random or anecdotal. Temporal anomalies constitute another striking pattern. Missing time, often measured in hours, recurs across solitary and group encounters alike. Whether the witness is an Air Force pilot tracking radar blips, a rural family in Brazil, or a teacher and student in England, the reports consistently describe a sudden lapse in subjective awareness followed by disorientation, confusion, or subtle physical effects. The files frequently note the alignment of these temporal gaps with environmental anomalies, such as electronic interference, unusual light emissions, or minor geomagnetic disturbances. Investigators repeatedly emphasize that these phenomena could not be explained by fatigue, conventional sleep cycles, or simple misperception. When such patterns emerge across decades and continents, they create a cumulative effect. The phenomenon appears to operate according to rules that defy conventional human understanding of time, perception, and causality. Cross-cultural consistency extends to post-encounter psychological responses. Declassified files reveal recurring reports of fear, confusion, heightened awareness, and lingering trauma. In some cases, hypnotic regression uncovers additional layers, including vivid recall of entities, procedural details, and sensory impressions from the abduction. Analysts in both American and foreign archives noted that these psychological responses were remarkably similar, even when cultural framing differed. For example, a rural African witness and a European airman might describe different environments or narratives, yet both recount identical physiological sensations, emotional states, and procedural sequences during their encounters. This convergence, repeated across decades, amplifies the perplexing uniformity of the phenomenon and challenges assumptions about cultural conditioning or imaginative invention. Even the artifacts and traces associated with these encounters show pattern-like consistency. Burns, scars, and implants often appear in similar locations, and environmental traces, such as scorched vegetation or magnetic interference, follow similar spatial and temporal distributions. Declassified files reveal that analysts frequently cross-referenced these anomalies with witness testimony, environmental readings, and historical precedents, creating a structured body of evidence. The repetition of these physical markers across different contexts strengthens the perception that abduction phenomena are neither random nor purely subjective. They suggest the presence of operational regularities that transcend individual cases. Investigators also observed patterns in the behavioral aspects of the phenomenon. Witnesses consistently describe a form of observation, assessment, or interaction that appears deliberate and methodical. Entities are depicted as conducting examinations with precision, often focusing on biological, neurological, or reproductive systems. The reports frequently highlight similar responses: physical immobilization, sensory awareness of unusual technology, and occasional communication that transcends language, often perceived as telepathic. Analysts across agencies and continents noted that while cultural interpretation might color the perception of these events, the structural consistency, both in behavior and sequence, is strikingly similar. Patterns extend to environmental and instrumental effects as well. Radar anomalies, unexplained electronic interference, and sudden disruptions of equipment are frequently documented in U.S., South American, and European military archives. Air Force flight logs, British Ministry of Defense memos, and Argentine military records all describe similar anomalies occurring in conjunction with abduction experiences. These disruptions often coincide with missing time, physical interaction, or entity observation, reinforcing a global pattern of interconnected phenomena that suggests systematic operational behavior rather than random occurrence. One of the most compelling aspects of these patterns is their persistence across decades. Files dating from the 1950s to the early 2000s document strikingly similar sequences of events, physical interactions, and psychological responses. The recurrence of these elements over time, across different continents, and under diverse cultural conditions challenges the notion that abduction phenomena can be dismissed as isolated incidents, delusions, or fabricated stories. Analysts within intelligence agencies repeatedly noted the difficulty of rational explanation. No known terrestrial technology, psychological model, or cultural factor could account for such persistent and uniform patterns. In addition, the global distribution of these patterns underscores the non-localized nature of the phenomenon. Whether in Brazil, England, the United States, Japan, or South Africa, reports reflect a convergence of entities, procedures, and effects that suggest a systematic phenomenon operating on a scale that transcends national boundaries. Declassified archives preserve these details meticulously, demonstrating that governments, despite skepticism or disbelief, recognize the significance of recurring motifs. Even when reports were labeled unexplained or psychologically improbable, analysts maintained detailed documentation, creating a comprehensive repository that captures both consistency and mystery. Finally, the repetition of these patterns presents a challenge to conventional scientific paradigms. Standard explanations, hallucination, cultural suggestion, psychological trauma, cannot account for the uniformity of entities, procedures, temporal anomalies, and physical traces across diverse contexts. Scientists and intelligence analysts alike confronted the paradox. While evidence could be systematically documented, its explanation remained elusive. The consistency of patterns, coupled with cross-cultural and temporal recurrence, suggests that the phenomenon operates according to its own rules that defy conventional logic, science, and understanding. Declassified files, preserved over decades, make clear that the phenomenon is structured, persistent, and globally recurrent, challenging observers to reconcile meticulous documentation with profound uncertainty. After decades of meticulous documentation, cross-continental investigation, and careful preservation, the declassified files offer a strikingly clear message. Alien abductions were not ignored, trivialized, or relegated entirely to the realm of folklore. Across multiple governments, American, British, Soviet, South American, Asian, and African, accounts were recorded, cross-referenced, and archived, often with extraordinary attention to detail. The files reveal not only the events themselves but the methodical approach taken by officials to examine them, documenting physical anomalies, psychological effects, environmental disturbances, and recurring patterns that, in aggregate, defy conventional explanation. The evidence is both broad and consistent. From individual reports of missing time, tactile examinations, and unexplained implants to group encounters, multi-witness corroboration, and physical traces, these files present a phenomenon that is structured, recurring, and persistent. Across decades and continents, analysts observed similar entities, procedural patterns, temporal anomalies, and psychological effects, leading to the unmistakable conclusion that these incidents were not isolated misperceptions or random hallucinations. The consistency of detail across cultural and geographic boundaries challenges both scientific and skeptical assumptions, suggesting a global phenomenon that transcends human imagination and cultural expectation. Declassified archives also reveal the caution with which governments treated this information. Skepticism was never absent. Intelligence officers, military investigators, and psychologists frequently questioned the credibility of witnesses, explored potential hoaxes, and evaluated psychological explanations. Yet despite doubt, files were retained, categorized, and preserved for future analysis. Skepticism, paradoxically, became a mechanism for thorough documentation rather than dismissal. Each report, no matter how improbable, was meticulously cross-referenced with prior cases, environmental readings, physical examinations, and corroborating testimony. In doing so, authorities created a structured archive capable of revealing patterns that would be invisible if individual cases were simply ignored or destroyed. The reasons for secrecy become evident when reviewing the files. Governments often cited public hysteria, operational security, and national defense as primary factors in limiting the disclosure of these reports. The possibility that unknown entities could observe, abduct, or experiment on humans raised questions of both strategic vulnerability and societal impact. By controlling information flow, governments could investigate without provoking panic while preserving evidence for future scientific, military, or intelligence purposes. Yet the files that were eventually declassified hint at a larger truth. If these incidents, already alarming and complex, were deemed worthy of eventual public release, then the full scope of what remains classified could be profoundly unsettling. Physical evidence, long considered one of the most compelling aspects of the phenomenon, reinforces the seriousness with which these encounters were recorded. Burns, scars, lesions, and alleged implants appear in declassified files from multiple countries, often verified by medical professionals and correlated with witness testimony. The attention paid to these anomalies demonstrates that officials did not dismiss such occurrences as purely subjective or imaginary. Environmental traces, electromagnetic interference, radar anomalies, and localized disturbances further under the empirical dimensions of the phenomenon. These repeated patterns, documented with rigor, reveal a reality that cannot be fully explained through conventional scientific or psychological frameworks. Psychological and hypnotic documentation adds another layer of intrigue. Regression sessions, memory recovery techniques, and psychological evaluations preserved in the archives illustrate the persistent interest of governments in understanding the effects of abduction on human consciousness. Witnesses consistently describe similar experiences: immobilization, examination, telepathic communication, and encounters with entities of uniform morphology. Files reveal that analysts grappled with the tension between subjective memory, hypnotically recovered recollection, and objective observation, yet preserved every detail for its potential investigative significance. Across nations, these records suggest that abduction phenomena were systematically studied, even when conventional interpretation failed to provide answers. Global distribution of the phenomenon strengthens the case for its significance. Declassified British, South American, Asian, and African files demonstrate that abductions were not a uniquely American obsession or a cultural anomaly. The same types of encounters, procedural patterns, and physical evidence were observed across continents, often in rural or isolated regions far removed from mass media influence. Analysts repeatedly noted cross-cultural consistency in entity description, procedural sequence, and temporal anomalies, indicating that the phenomenon operates according to a set of rules or patterns that transcend geography and culture. This consistency lends credence to the notion that these occurrences are not random, localized events, but part of a broader, global phenomenon that governments took seriously. Moreover, the files reveal the complexity of investigation and the professional rigor applied to even the most incredulous cases. Skepticism coexisted with careful documentation. Ridicule and doubt never precluded the preservation of records. Hoaxes were noted, psychological explanations were explored, and extraordinary claims were scrutinized. Yet anomalies were retained, patterns were analyzed, and cross-references were maintained. The resulting archives are simultaneously skeptical and compelling. They contain both ordinary human doubt and the extraordinary details of encounters that continue to defy explanation. What emerges from the totality of declassified material is a sobering realization. Alien abduction, once dismissed by mainstream media or public perception as the domain of fantasy and imagination, was, in fact, a documented subject of investigation across decades and borders. Governments meticulously preserved records, studied physical evidence, and monitored psychological impacts, all while carefully controlling the flow of information. The files reveal a phenomenon both structured and persistent, one that operates according to patterns observable across time, space, and culture, yet remains enigmatic in origin, purpose, and mechanism. For viewers and researchers alike, the files leave a chilling question. If what has been declassified represents only a fraction of total documentation, what remains hidden in classified archives? The released reports, already extraordinary in their consistency and detail, hint at a far deeper and more complex reality. Patterns that challenge scientific logic, recurring entities, physical and psychological anomalies, and global distribution collectively suggest that much more may exist beyond public awareness. The deliberate retention, careful classification, and eventual selective declassification imply a phenomenon that governments have long monitored, studied, and, until recently, shielded from general scrutiny. In conclusion, the declassified files compel a reassessment of how alien abduction phenomena are understood. Far from isolated or trivial, these encounters were consistently documented, cross-referenced, and studied by authorities in multiple countries. Physical evidence, psychological assessment, multi-witness corroboration, and global distribution collectively point to a phenomenon that cannot be easily dismissed. Skepticism coexisted with rigorous documentation, reinforcing the integrity of the records. And while the files declassified to the public offer extraordinary insights, they also leave a lingering, unsettling question. If these stories, so chilling and structured, were allowed into public view, how much more remains hidden in the vaults of government secrecy? The files themselves become a testament to the uncharted frontier of human experience, a puzzle that invites both wonder and unease.